Today's session is localization best practice for authors. And for me, when we're talking about best practice, we're talking about how we can best enable success. Let's then consider localization success. Off the top of your head, when you think about localization success, who do you think of as the most important players? I want to share with you my thought process and my answer to this question. I've been working in the localization industry for over 15 years now. And at the start of my career, my perception was that localization was fundamentally all about translation. That was key. That was what it was all about. So the obvious conclusion I came to was that the people that do translation, the translators, they must be the most important. But then, as I progressed through my career as a localization project manager, I began to think that I was the most important stakeholder. I saw my role as key because the localization project manager is the person who facilitates the translator to do their job well and who works with the client to understand their needs and make the work happen. The PM then was the most important thing. But more recently, I've entered the third stage of my career, and my perception has shifted again. In this stage, I've come to realise that the people that have the most influence, the people who are the key determinants of localization success, in my mind, are the people right at the beginning of the process, the authors and the creators of the source content. In order for me to explain this fundamental idea behind my localization best practice ethos, I'll elaborate on what I think of as localization success. What does that mean? Because again, best practice for me is all about enabling success. What is localization success then? And to me, it's twofold. And this possibly comes from my project management background. So putting on my PM hat, success means two things. We have to deliver the output, in this case, the translated content. That's the tangible physical thing we need to have at the end of the process. We need to deliver that asset, that output, to be deemed successful. But we also need something else. We need that output, that thing, to deliver the benefits and the outcomes that we require. What this is will be determined by the purpose of the individual piece of content. Is it to educate, inform, to sell? But if we don't deliver on that requirement, then we haven't succeeded. We may have the content, the output, but it isn't achieving anything. Success then requires both of these things, outputs and the outcomes. And in localization terms, outputs requires translated content, but it has to be the outputs we require. And so, in my mind, to succeed, we're striving to be able to provide content in as many languages as we need or hope for. If we hoped to deliver 10 languages, but we can only deliver 5, then we haven't succeeded in delivering the full complement of outputs. What holds us back then? And often the key constraint here is money, budget. An example of this in action is a scenario I've encountered a number of times over the years. The localization chicken and egg conundrum. Which came first, the translated content or the sales in a market? The in-country team might be saying, we're not able to sell this particular product because the content isn't available in our language. It stops consumers buying our product. And the response is, no, but as soon as you sell it, as soon as you sell enough, then we'll localize the content. And this scenario comes about almost inevitably because the constraint is budget. Let's assume that the budget is fixed. What can we do to break down this barrier, to remove or reduce that constraint? If we have a budget of $10,000, for example, and currently each asset costs $2,000, is there an opportunity for us to make changes so that each language costs $1,000? And then we can deliver 10 languages instead of 5. And of course, there are many ways we could shave costs off if we don't deliver the same quality. But if we want to deliver the same content to the same quality, I would argue that the answer is to get better value. We can change what that money buys us by reducing effort and reducing cost. And by doing so, we make our content more scalable. And we can do this on a relatively small scale at all stages in the process. My argument is that it's the decisions and the changes we can make early on in the process, at the design and authoring stage, that allow us to make savings on a much larger scale, and hence have the greatest impact on our ability to scale our content and deliver the successful outputs we wish to. I've talked about outputs. My second localization success criteria was delivering outcomes, delivering results. Is the localized content achieving its purpose, whatever that may be? Key to this, and this applies to English source content and localized content, is making the content understandable for the translators and for the end users. Only if these people can comprehend the content, if it's understandable, can it deliver the outcomes that we require. So there are these two pillars. To my mind, localization success requires content to be scalable and understandable. If we think back then to my original question, who do we think the most important person or group of people are with regards to localization success? For me, as I've mentioned, the key factor is when those people are involved in the content process, because translation happens at the end. It's considered often an add-on that happens at the end. Something to be thought about, something to be considered only once the content has been created. And yes, translation does happen at the end, and it can be considered a relatively small part of the overall process. On a fundamental level, translated content is a mirror of the English source. If we think of it as simply the same content in different languages. What that means is that as we move through the content creation process, as we go down this road, the ability to influence how scalable and how understandable that content is diminishes. Those key decisions that shape the English source content, and again, the translation is a mirror of that, those decisions are made early on in the process. They're made by the authors and the designers. And it's the potential magnitude of change, the scale of the impact that can be had, that leads me to believe that it's these people who are key. That, in essence, is my localization best practice ethos. Let's consider this content creation road in its oversimplified form as a timeline. I'll now step through the journey then and look at some tips and tricks, some ideas for how to impact both how scalable and how understandable the source content is. And I will be talking solely about the English source content throughout, because as I hope to have said, that's where the bulk of opportunities lie. That's where we can have the most impact on the end success of our localization journey. And on this journey, one of the first things that happens, the first things that's decided, is tools. The tools that are used for content creation. It may be that within your organisation the tool set is fixed, it's not going to change. I think though it's still really important to have an understanding of the impact that tools have on localization success. Partly because even if we can't change the tool that we use, can we change the features within that tool that we use? And also because positions may change and technical communications is changing. There are new technologies being adapted all the time. The use of video, for example, AR and VR. It's really important that whenever a decision is made about a tool, that localization is considered. The first thing to consider is interoperability. The interaction between different systems, and this is within your organisation and possibly with external vendors as well. Can the systems work with each other? Can they share content? For example, does the tool you use for authoring technical content allow you to pull content from other areas, from a PIM system, an ERP system? Does your CMS allow you that interaction? Can you, for example, author your content once and then reuse it in multiple content types? This might be, again, a feature in your CMS. It might be a feature if you use a DITA framework or you use snippets in Metcalf Flare. The question with regards to tooling is which tools have these features, which don't. Because tooling determines what options are available to us when the content is being created. If the tool doesn't have that feature, it isn't available to you. Once a tool is decided on, how you author, how you design, how you interact with other systems, all of these things are determined and set by the tool itself. What tool you use then has a huge impact on what you're able to do, particularly with regards to streamlining and reducing effort. I mentioned authoring once and reusing, sharing content between systems. The reason we do that is to eliminate waste, reduce effort, and reduce cost. I can share a case study showing the impact that tooling decisions had on localization cost for one of Rubric's clients. This client moved to a DITA-based architecture, and that enabled the content to be authored once and reused. They also implemented a system that enabled the creation of PDFs at the click of a button. The DTP, the localization layout step, was removed. The immediate cost saving, and that came from removing that layout step, was 30% of the total localization cost. Longer term, by authoring once and reusing, the volume of content reduced, translation volumes reduced, a 60% reduction in localization cost resulted. Of course, there was an investment in this, investment in the tools and training, but I hope that this illustrates my point about scale, that decisions made early on are the decisions that have an impact on a scale that isn't possible later on. Another consideration regarding tool choice is the scalability of the tool itself. What is its longevity? From a localization perspective, for example, you may intend in the future to go into right-to-left languages, Arabic, Hebrew. Does the tool support those? This is a scenario we've come across, and it perhaps provides an example of the worst-case scenario. A tool decision is made, a tool is purchased, often at significant cost, and over time there's a realization that actually this tool doesn't meet our needs. We want to go into these languages, but the tool doesn't allow it. A new tool then needs to replace that, again at significant cost. Had localization needs been considered when the tooling decision was made in the first place, this, what was essentially a waste of money, could have been avoided. Back on our hypothetical content road then. Decisions on tools have been made. What's next in our content creation timeline? Design. During the design stage, the aim is the same. We're looking to eliminate wasted effort, wasted time, which result in wasted money. So where can we avoid that? Where can we design out, engineer out wasted effort? I think the fundamental idea here is to design not for the English, but for all languages, and to consider that through the design process. Because what we're looking to do is avoid the need to tweak or change the localized versions after the translation process, at that post-translation layout stage. That might be to fix graphic texts that overrun or move overlapping text, reducing font size because text doesn't fit in the available space. And with smart design, the need for tweaks can be reduced by incorporating white space and designing to allow for text expansion, by using callouts in graphics so the graphic doesn't change and text won't overlap. Sticking with graphics, let's look at another case study of the difference made by designing out effort. We suggested that a client of ours changed the way graphics were designed so that the text in graphics was externalized. This meant it could be exported and imported at the click of a button. The effort of manually copying and pasting content out and back into the graphics was removed. A relatively small change. There was no change to what the graphics looked like in the end output, but we had eliminated wasted effort. For each language, this used to take about 30 minutes. This client had about 60 manuals a year into 22 languages. A small change that resulted in tens of thousands of dollars saved a year. Because that's the other thing about these changes. Because we're making changes at the source, in the architecture and the way we work, these are ongoing savings. These small changes that we can easily implement soon add up. And perhaps there are other examples that you can share regarding ways to adapt design to remove or reduce the need to tweak and adapt content after translation. But coming back to our content journey then, we've looked at tools and design. The key factor in both of these two areas, in terms of localization success, is being scalable by reducing effort and hence cost, so that that same budget delivers more. Moving through the journey, we come now to the content itself, the actual copy. And here, it's fairly obvious that the content has an impact on how understandable our content is, on comprehension. You may be familiar with the concept of garbage in, garbage out, and because the English, the quality of the English is reflected in those translated versions, of course that impacts on how understandable it is, at comprehension. What may be less obvious with regards to content is the potential impact that we can have on scalability. Because again, we have those same types of opportunities to reduce effort, both for writers and for translators, and hence reduce cost and increase scalability. The first way in which we can do this is to decrease the total volume of words, the overall word count. And this is important because When you think of translation, essentially, words cost money. As a simplistic example, if we were to say in 100 words what we had previously said in 200, that could halve the translation cost because the word count is halved. I've spoken already in relation to tools about the idea of authoring once and reusing content. This is an important one for volume because it can have a really significant impact on reducing our total word count, not just when the content is authored that first time, but also when there need to be updates further down the line. If, for example, we have 50 different user guides and each of them has a copyright section, and it says exactly the same thing, if that needs to be changed 50 times, then that has an impact on effort, because somebody has to make that change 50 times, and on cost. If, however, it only needs to be done once, and we reuse that content, it reduces effort and increases scalability. The other thing to consider when looking to reduce overall volume is to think about the value of the words themselves. When writing, think, do I need this word? Is it adding anything to the overall meaning, to the understanding of my end user? Is it aiding comprehension? And if you don't need it, get rid of it. Are we able to say in 100 words what we previously said in 200 and potentially halve our translation cost? I can give another example, this time on the impact of being concise. We worked at the end of last year on a body of content that a client had written in English for an English-speaking audience, never intending that it be localized. That then changed. There was a need to localize that content, but the content hadn't been written with localization in mind. It hadn't been considered, and as a result, the volume of content simply made it prohibitively expensive to localize into the number of languages the client required. They couldn't deliver the outputs. It was very verbose, very wordy, and unnecessarily so, it was decided. We worked with this client to identify how the content could be changed in order to ensure the meaning was kept, but the volume of content was reduced, and the cost per language was therefore reduced because we had less words. In doing so, we were able to increase the number of languages they could localize into by 50%, purely by decreasing the total volume of words, because that meant the budget didn't change, but they could reach a wider audience. They could do what they wanted with that same budget. Another consideration when thinking of ways that we can reduce the overall volume of content is to identify non-translatable text within your content. Because if we can identify that content during the authoring stage, tag it somehow, and be consistent in the way we do that, it can then be again excluded from the translation process in its entirety, reducing the volume of content, the word count that you're paying for. And this might be tables of part numbers and quantities, for example, or measurements. Are these non-translatable, and can they be excluded? And different corporations deal with these things in different ways. Sometimes a rule is decided on for numeric content, for example, that it will follow the rules of English for exactly this reason. Again, I can share another example of a client who made this change to their content. They had multiple tables of non-translatable content in their user manuals, data sheets as well. By removing that content from their translation process, their costs reduced by 8%. Again, a simple change, but made early on during the process, during the authoring stage, and the scale of savings was significant. I've spoken about decreasing the total volume of words and improving scalability that way. Another way, and I've touched on this already, is to improve reuse. I've spoken about this in terms of tooling, but in terms of the content for localization, we're talking about authoring here. And that brings me on to the use of translation memories. Because the key thing here in terms of localization reuse is how effectively a translation memory is used, because that has a significant impact on cost during the translation process. And again, it comes back to authoring. Let's take a look at a couple of examples now. I've used 10 languages and 20 cents per word here as a very rough illustrative guide to give you an idea. We have a sentence in the translation memory that's been translated. This is in the first column, the purple column. In the next column is content for translation as a new handoff, a new project that's an exact match to that original content. It incurs no cost because it's exactly the same. In the next column, this is in a different project, and there are a couple of small tweaks, minor changes. And these can be very small. A single change, an additional hyphen, a comma, a change to capitalization. Because it's not the same, the industry standard here is that this content will be charged at 50% of the word rate. Here, that's 24 words, 10 languages is $24. In the next column, the changes are more significant. The meaning is the same, but somebody has reworded this. Because the changes are more significant, the way translation memories work, there are matching algorithms, and this would be considered not a good enough match to be useful to the translator. It's not a fuzzy match, it's not good, it can't be charged at a lower rate. It will be charged as new words, charged at the full word rate. These are small amounts, but these examples give you an idea of the cost differences that we're looking at. Again, though, small amounts, but it's a question of scale. These costs relate to a single sentence. If these kinds of small, unnecessary tweaks were made multiple times, say 20 times in a document, over 100 documents, it soon adds up to significant dollar amounts. The question here is, do these things need to be different? Should it actually be the same? And key here is having an understanding of the cost that these small differences carry, so that we can consider the value. Sometimes it will, of course, be valid. There's a reason it should be different. But in those cases where it should be the same, how can we maximize translation memory usage? Because it does have a significant impact on cost and scalability. If it should be the same, how can we make that happen? What processes, what structures can we put in place to ensure that we're maximizing reuse? I talked in the tools section about authoring once and reusing, but that isn't possible for everyone because it's a tooling consideration. If that isn't possible, there are ways that we can achieve the same thing and increase reuse. It could be a case of creating templates, master versions of content that are then reused. I also spoke earlier about excluding entire sections of non-translatable content in order to reduce the overall volume, the word count. But there are also opportunities to improve reuse in the same way. We can identify non-translatable content within repeated text. Let's look at an example of this. In this example, we have the same content 4 times, 4 different product manuals. The difference is a non-translatable product number. Here it's been replaced by the blue tag because it's been conditionalized, during the authoring process and can then be removed from the translation scope. The content is identical, that's the only difference, and approaching it in this way means that we can translate once and reuse. We only pay for it once. The cost then, in this example, is $52. Whereas let's compare what would happen if this was just handled as normal text. Again, the product number is in blue and it's different each time. So we don't get exact matching with the translation memory, we get fuzzy matches. The resulting cost is $135. And again, it's a question of scale because each time this sentence appears in a new manual for a new product, this one sentence costs $27. The key to all of these strategies succeeding is that there's a structure and there's rules in place and that they're used consistently. If there aren't, I found that these preferential changes start to slip through. Just a tweak here, an amendment there. And part of this is people not realising the impact that these small changes have, because it is, and it feels like, a very small, inconsequential change, but it isn't. It has this impact on cost and on scalability. The key is where they're unnecessary preferential changes, we want to minimise or remove these. Ways of doing this include the use of style guides, glossaries, dictionaries that act, again, as these structures, these rules. One of the other areas, though, regarding scalability and understandable content, talking about structure and rules, is frameworks such as Simplified Technical English that can be used to help. Now, STE is a specific framework that may or may not be appropriate for your organisation. I think the ethos, though, can be applied universally because the idea is you decide on the meaning of a word and you stick to it. And importantly, each word only has one meaning. There's no potential for ambiguity, and it also improves reuse because the same words are used rather than synonyms being used. Let me step back and just have a final word on scale for now, because the scale on which we apply these rules, these best practices, are really key as well if we're looking to reduce volume, improve consistency, maximise reuse. Ideally, these principles would be applied within a department, across departments, and throughout an entire organisation. Then we're looking at changes, we're looking at impacts on a completely different scale of magnitude. If you have any experiences, any insights about this organisational change question, does this happen in your organisation or not? If not, why? If so, how did it happen? That would be really interesting. I think it's a really big question. How can these silos between departments be broken down so that content is looked at as a whole, so that we're maximising all of these best practices? Often it seems that content is looked at by department or by content type. But another way to consider how content relates to each other, that interrelationship, is looking at the user journey. For example, let's consider someone who was considering a purchase of product A. They might go on the website to get an idea of the product information, download a data sheet to get some technical information, a brochure to understand features. If they then purchase the product, they'll interact with the UI or HMI. They might go to the online help or read the user manual. The user consumes all of these different types of content, but they're likely to have been written by different departments, different individuals. But shouldn't they be seen as a whole? If the complete body of content is considered as a whole and those interrelationships are considered, it's then that we can see the biggest possible impact on effort, cost, scalability. This is looking at one product. If we scale that up across different products, across multiple product lines, so we're looking at the entire corporate content corpus, we'd be able to achieve scalability on an entirely different scale. Coming back then now to the content creation journey. We're at the content stage, we've thought about how we can make our content scalable. The next question is ensuring it's understandable. Let's look again quickly at why this is important. And it's because that second pillar of success, as well as delivering outputs, the translated content itself, we must ensure we're able to deliver the outcomes, be it to educate, inform, sell, and we can only do that if the content connects with our audience. I've spoken already about being concise in relation to scalability, but being concise also has a really key role in comprehension. The reason for that generally, I think, is that being concise forces us to simplify our content, and simplicity in turn improves how accessible the content is. I'm of the opinion that writing simply, writing concise content isn't about dumbing down. It isn't about reducing the complexity of what we're saying. It's about making our content accessible for the end user and, in the case of localization, for the translator as well. Being concise reduces the risk of errors and misunderstanding. And I'll share some examples with you now on the screen of where that misunderstanding can come through. I'll give you a moment to read through these. There's two examples here. We have the English copy at the top of each. The problem area is shown in blue, and the queries that this content generated are shown below. And I think this is interesting because I hope these examples illustrate that misunderstanding can be a tricky one. You may have read these sentences, as I did, and thought, I know exactly what that means. The thing is that not everybody agreed. People had different ideas of what this content meant. They interpreted it in different ways, and that's where ambiguity becomes a problem. As a slight aside on this topic, there's an argument I've heard in the past that it's the translator's job to be able to decipher the English source content, to make sense of it and translate it well. And that can be a valid argument, but I think that during the authoring process, there is a golden opportunity to reduce or even remove the risk of these errors and ambiguities. And if we then put in place excellent translators, how much better would the end product be? How much better the end user experience? How much more successful our localization? And if we think back to my interpretation of localization success and the desire to get our content to as wide an audience as possible, we can have other wins here too with simplicity. I'm focusing on the effect on localization. But if authors write more simplistic, easily accessible English content, the audience can be widened further beyond native English-speaking subject matter experts, perhaps to non-native English speakers, those with not such a good grasp of English, or people who aren't experts in that area. And I would argue that, again, surely if our content reaches more people, reaches a wider audience, we have been more successful. But how? How can we do this? How do we write more concisely? I've already touched on the idea of challenging every word. What's this adding? Is it necessary? Can I say it in one word instead of 4. Challenge yourself as well by putting yourself in the shoes of somebody that isn't a native English speaker, for example, or isn't a subject matter expert. We can self-analyze our content, but I think even better sometimes is to have somebody else look at the content. It might be somebody in the office, it might be somebody at home, and I think ideally they shouldn't be a subject matter expert. A method that I have used is when somebody else reads the content, if they have to stop and think or go back and read something again, when that happens, they can just put a minus sign next to that content, and that indicates they struggled. On the other hand, if they were able to read it and got the message, understood what you were saying, they can put a plus sign next to that. When I've done this, I found it a really enlightening exercise, and I think it's certainly proved to me that in contrast to those claims that writing simple content is about dumbing down, it showed me that it's the simple content that resonates, that gets our message across. The key point with regards to translation is that there's no ambiguity. The meaning is clear, the message is clear, and translators can communicate that message then to their intended audience in other languages. My final point around content and being understandable is fairly obvious. It's that it's important to ensure the English content is error-free. The localized versions are mirrors of the English. If there are errors in the English, there are likely to be errors in the localized versions too. That brings me to the end of our content creation timeline and almost to the end of today's presentation. We've made decisions on tools, we've designed, written, and now it's time for the translation phase. And the aim is that because of the decisions made during those phases earlier on in the process, the translation phase will be relatively straightforward, with no wasted effort, no head scratching. Localization success has been enabled because the source content is scalable and understandable. To summarize then, my key message would be that localization best practice, it's not for authors, it's all about authors.